The morning after my wife's funeral, I drove to the cemetery alone. It was just past 6. The grass was still wet, and the sky had that flat gray color that comes before the sun decides what kind of day it wants to be. I stood at Margaret's grave and I held my checkbook. Not open, just hold it, the way you hold something when you don't quite know what to do with your hands. The night before, at the reception, my son Derek handed me a bill, printed, itemized, $22,340, and I paid for it, every cent. I know how that sounds. But by the time Derek woke up that next morning, the world he had been quietly assembling for himself, the one he believed was already half his, had already come apart. And I want to be honest with you about something. He did most of that himself. Welcome back. I'm glad you're here. On this channel, we tell family stories with honesty and quiet dignity. We don't look away from the hard parts. But to understand what happened, you need to know who Margaret and I were. Before any of this happened, my life was steady in the way a good pair of boots is steady. Not fancy, just dependable. Margaret and I were married 39 years ago. We built our house in 1987 on a gravel road just outside town. That September, 3 neighbors came over with shovels and a rented mixer, and we poured the foundation ourselves. I can still see the dust on our jeans and the way Margaret brought out lemonade in a chipped glass pitcher. We didn't have much, but the walls went up straight, and we never missed a payment. I worked the early shift at the utility company for 34 years. Out the door at 4:30 a.m., home by mid-afternoon. In 2018, I retired with a pension that won't impress anyone, but it shows up on time. Margaret ran the school lunch program for 27 years. She knew every child with a peanut allergy and which ones needed an extra carton of milk slipped onto their tray. We were careful people, bills paid off early, receipts folded and dated. I kept a yellow legal pad in the kitchen drawer where I wrote every expense in small, square handwriting. That drawer still smells faintly of pencil shavings and coffee. Derek grew up in that house. I coached his Little League team, drove him to wrestling practice in an old Ford that rattled at every stoplight, helped him move into 3 different apartments over 6 years. He was always chasing something better, an opportunity, he called it. He had ideas, energy, but he didn't always have patience. His first business, a landscaping outfit, folded in 2019. Equipment payments stacked up. Vendors started calling. Around that same time, Margaret got her first troubling test results. Nothing confirmed yet, just words like concerning, and we need to monitor this. She sat at the kitchen table twisting her wedding ring while the coffee went cold. Derek owed $31,000 when it was done. I paid it quietly, every dollar. I never told Margaret. I didn't want her carrying that on top of everything else, and I never told Derek it was anything more than taken care of. I suppose I thought that was love. In 2021, he started an equipment rental company. He needed a co-signer for a $14,000 loan. I signed. I didn't hesitate. A man deserves a second chance, especially your own son. I never called those amounts debts. I told myself they were gifts. Looking back, that may have been my blind spot. I kept giving without ever letting him feel the weight of receiving. For a long time, I told myself Derek would find his footing. I kept waiting for the version of him I believed in to show up. There were signs I should have read sooner. The first thing that changed was the Sundays. Derek used to call most weekends. Not long conversations. Just, "Hey Dad, how's Mom?" And a little update about work. Around 2020, those calls thinned out. Then they stopped. I told myself grown men get busy. When he did come by, he moved through the house differently. Slower, his eyes lingered on the china cabinet, the garage shelves, the cedar chest at the foot of our bed. At the time, I figured he was distracted, tired. Now I understand he wasn't looking at memories. He was measuring them. Margaret's diagnosis turned serious in early 2022. A progressive heart condition. Medication lined up in a plastic organizer. A specialist visits twice a month at the city hospital. I became her caregiver without ever announcing it. I cut back my volunteer hours at the VFW, kept a separate notebook for her blood pressure readings and appointments. The kitchen table turned into a small command center of pill bottles and insurance statements. Derek visited 4 times in 14 months. Each visit was brief. He'd hug his mother gently, stand at the edge of her recliner, then drift toward the garage. Once, I told him he could take an extra set of tools. Another time, he mentioned being behind on a utility bill. I wrote him a check for $800. He folded it quickly, like it might blow away. I told myself this was normal. Families help each other. Next door, Rena came by twice a week with casseroles or soup. She and Margaret had been close for 22 years. Rena never kept score. She'd wash her own dish before leaving. One afternoon when I came back from the pharmacy, she stood by my truck and said, "Walt, I'm going to say this once, and then I won't say it again. Derek is counting money he hasn't left yet." I thanked her. That was all, but her words followed me inside. In the fall of 2022, Derek called and asked almost casually whether the house was in both our names or just mine. I said both. He said, "Just curious. Estate planning stuff." I told him okay. Then I went to the kitchen, opened the drawer, and wrote that question down on my legal pad. Margaret passed on a Tuesday in March. I had 13 days between her death and the funeral to sit in that house and think. I thought about a lot of things. What I didn't expect was what Derek had planned for the reception. Margaret's funeral was on a gray Saturday in late March. The church smelled of lilies and floor polish. Folding chairs lined the back wall because more people came than we expected. I shook hands. I thanked people. I held myself together the way a man does when he knows if he starts, he may not stop. Afterward, we gathered in the fellowship hall. Coffee in white styrofoam cups. Ham sandwiches cut into neat triangles. I was standing near the metal coffee urn when Derek walked over. He was dressed sharper than I'd seen him in a while. Pressed shirt, polished shoes. He carried a manila folder. He set it beside my cup. "Dad," he said quietly, "I know the timing isn't great. But we talked about this. I kept track of everything. I opened it. 14 months of line items. Mileage reimbursement for visits. Caregiving hours billed at $18 an hour. Grocery runs. A printer cartridge. Even phone calls, rounded into flat fees. At the bottom, typed neatly, $22,340. I read every line. The room kept moving around me. Cups clinking, low conversations, someone laughing too loudly at a memory. "Did we talk about this?" I asked. He shifted his weight. We talked about how much I was sacrificing. I figured we'd square it up later. I closed the folder and tucked it under my arm. Across the room, Rena was watching. She didn't step in. She just held my eyes for a second. I gave her the smallest nod I could manage. 2 of Margaret's sisters had seen the exchange, though they couldn't have known what was inside. Derek seemed to take my silence as agreement. His shoulders eased. He went to pour himself coffee, shaking hands like a man who'd handled something responsibly. That evening, the house was quiet in a new way. I sat at the kitchen table. The blue coffee pot was still half full from the morning. I opened the folder again and went line by line. 4 grocery runs he'd listed were on days my own bank statement showed I'd used my card at the store. 3 full days of caregiving hours matched dates in the home health aides log, where she'd signed in for the entire shift. I didn't rush. I just read. Then I took out my checkbook. I wrote $22,340. Signed it. Slid it into an envelope with Derek's name on the front. I left it on the counter where he'd see it. After that, I opened the kitchen drawer and took out my legal pad. I want to be clear about something. By the time Derek handed me that folder, I had already spent 4 months doing something he never thought I was capable of. paying attention. That question about the deed was the moment I stopped waiting. I didn't argue with Derek that day. I didn't accuse him of anything. The following week, I went to the regional bank and asked to speak with someone about estate planning. A woman there answered what she could and gave me the name of an attorney 2 towns over. The next Wednesday, I drove out there, sat in a leather chair that squeaked when I shifted. I asked questions. I took notes on my legal pad. Over the next 4 months, I made changes. I updated the beneficiary designations on my retirement accounts, directing them into a small family trust instead of listing Derek by name. I removed him from the joint savings account Margaret had added him to years earlier for convenience. I stopped the quiet monthly transfers I'd been sending to help with his equipment business money he'd begun treating like clockwork. And I notified the lender on that co-signed loan that I would not guarantee any future modifications. They reviewed his file after that. I told one person, Raina, not details, just this. If something happens to me before this is settled, the paperwork is in the fireproof box in the bedroom closet. She nodded, didn't pry. During those same months, Derek was pleasant, helped me move a heavy cabinet once, called on Thanksgiving. He had no idea. He thought my silence was surrender. He'd thought that for 40 years. The morning after the funeral, Derek called his bank. Then he called me. I let it go to voicemail. Derek called 3 times before 9 the next morning. I let the phone ring. On the 4th call, I answered. His voice was tight. Quick, Dad. There's got to be some mistake at the bank. Which bank? I asked. The joint savings. They're saying I'm not on it anymore. I restructured that account several months ago, I said. It was the right thing to do for the estate. Silence, then sharper. Why would you do that? We had an understanding. When was that understanding put in writing? I asked. He didn't answer. I told him the check for $22,340 was on the counter if he wanted to pick it up. He arrived within the hour. Rena's kitchen window faces my driveway. The curtain moved once. She didn't come out. Derek took the porch steps fast. He still had a key. He used it, walked in carrying that same restless energy he'd had since he was 16. The check was where I'd left it. He picked it up, glanced at the amount, and folded it once. No thank you. There's also the retirement accounts, he said. Mom told me your mother told you what she hoped, I said. She didn't tell you what the paperwork said. That's not fair. I agree, I said. A lot of things haven't been fair. His voice rose. You're doing this out of spite. You never really supported me. I looked at him. I remember the landscaping business, I said. He went still for half a second. I opened the kitchen drawer and took out my legal pad. I set it on the counter between us. I didn't open it, didn't flip a page. I just let it rest there. He looked down at it. His shoulders shifted, almost without him noticing. I kept records too, I said. That was all. I didn't list numbers, didn't mention dates. I didn't have to. He knew what he'd billed. He knew the transfers that had shown up every month like clockwork. He knew about the questions over the deed. The room felt different then. Quieter, he slid the check into his jacket pocket. Maybe I should talk to a lawyer. That's your right, I said. He waited like he expected me to argue. I didn't. After a moment, he turned and left. I watched from the kitchen window as he backed out of the driveway a little too fast, gravel scattering behind his tires. 20 minutes later, there was a knock. Rena, she came in without ceremony, poured herself coffee from the blue pot, and sat across from me at the table Margaret used to run like a command center. We didn't speak at first. Finally, she said, "Are you doing okay?" "I think so," I told her. She studied me for a moment. Margaret would have said you took too long. I almost smiled. She would have been right. We sat there in that kitchen, the morning light coming through the thin curtains, the legal pad still on the counter. Not the confrontation, not the check. That quiet table that was the center of it. Derek cashed that check 3 days later. By then, a few other things had already begun to settle into place on their own. Derek deposited the check the same day he picked it up. Within hours, he'd spoken to his bank. They told him the joint savings account had been restructured properly months earlier. Nothing improper, nothing reversible without my consent. He called the estate attorney listed in Margaret's will. That's when he learned the retirement accounts no longer flowed directly to him. They moved into a small family trust instead. He wasn't cut out entirely. There was a modest request waiting once probate closed. But it wasn't the future he'd been quietly counting on. Over the next 2 weeks, he called twice more. I answered once. "I'm happy to communicate through the estate process," I told him. "It'll be cleaner for everyone." He mentioned the $22,340 to two of Margaret's sisters, expecting, I think, sympathy. One of them asked him gently whether the dates on his bill matched the days he'd actually been present. Small towns don't explode with news. They absorb it. By the end of the month, people understood enough. By early summer, the equipment rental loan came up for routine review. Derek had missed 2 payments. When the lender saw my earlier notice declining future guarantees, they tightened their review. That wasn't my doing. It was paperwork meeting reality. The business folded quietly by late August. Derek moved to another county after that. We are not dramatically estranged. There were no slammed doors, no final speeches. I simply stopped being the floor he stood on. He received what the will allowed. Modest, lawful, final, the house remains mine. The accounts are arranged the way I arranged them. There has been no lawsuit, no letters from attorneys beyond what probate requires. Whatever anger pushed him that morning has thinned into something else. I suspect embarrassment, though I've never said that aloud. Rena still comes by on Wednesdays. We have coffee at the kitchen table, same blue pot, same light through the curtains. In June, she helped me go through Margaret's clothes. That was the hardest afternoon of the year. We worked slowly, folded some things for donation, kept a few sweaters that still held her shape in the shoulders. Rena didn't try to cheer me up. She just stayed. I've gone back to volunteering at the VFW on Fridays. Nothing heavy, just paperwork and coffee refills. I planted a small garden along the south fence line this spring. Tomatoes, green beans. Things Margaret used to talk about doing next year. The legal pad is still in the drawer. I haven't opened it in months. There's a quiet now that feels different from the silence after the funeral. This one isn't heavy, it's settled. People ask me sometimes, or maybe I just imagine they would, whether I feel bad about how it ended with Derek. I've thought about that a lot. I've had time to think about what this was really about. It wasn't $22,340. It wasn't the accounts. It wasn't even the business folding. What I almost lost was my own attention. For years, I told myself that patience was the same thing as love, that if I just kept steady, kept paying, kept smoothing things over, everything would right itself. I'm not certain I handled every step perfectly. I am certain I didn't act out of cruelty. The hardest part wasn't the paperwork. It was accepting that protecting yourself from someone you love is not the same thing as stopping loving them. That distinction matters. If you're a parent who's given past the point of wisdom, you know what I mean. There's a moment when loyalty turns into something else. Giving without boundaries isn't love. It's fear wearing love's clothing. Margaret used to say I took too long to see things. Maybe she was right. But the garden along the south fence line is growing now. Tomatoes climbing the stakes. Green beans curling around their wires. It was her idea, years ago. Some things arrive late and still grow. If you've ever been handed a bill, you didn't owe not a paper bill, but the kind that comes from someone who should have known better. I'd like to hear about it. Leave me a comment. Tell me what happened, or what you wish you'd done differently. I read every one. And if quiet stories about real families matter to you, stay with us here at Silent Father. We don't make noise. We just tell the truth. I paid the bill, every cent, and it was the most useful thing I ever did.